L'onore di presentare questo panel, in particolar modo il professor Younger. Il professor Rupert Younger è fondatore e direttore del Centro for Corporate Reputation dell'Università di Oxford e coautore di un libro interessantissimo che consiglio a tutti, sorry for marketing, The Reputation Game and the Activist Manifesto. Molto spesso il professor Younger è ospitato dalle grandi testate giornalistiche come BBC, CNN, il Financial Times, The Wall Street Journal. È uno dei più grandi esperti di reputazione che esistono in Europa ed è anche stato nominato dalla regina Elisabetta alto sceriffo di Hampshire per il 2013 e il 2014, quindi veramente un grandissimo onore avere il professor Younger oggi a Torino. Io vorrei fare soltanto due parole su ovviamente la mia azienda, su Intesa Sanpaolo, perché noi oggi parliamo di visibile e invisibile, chiaramente Intesa Sanpaolo, e quindi di un tema che ha chiaramente una valenza sociale. Chiaramente, come sapete, Intesa Sanpaolo da sempre attribuisce un ruolo centrale ai progetti che sono rivolti alla crescita sociale, culturale, civile. Valorizziamo il patrimonio artistico italiano, vogliamo essere un punto di riferimento per il terzo settore. Forniamo sostegno alle persone in difficoltà e cerchiamo in qualche modo di essere utili alla società, e quindi sono molto contento che Intesa Sanpaolo sia partner di questo evento. Sono anche molto felice del fatto che questo evento si tenga in questo grattacielo che io trovo bellissimo. Peraltro, lavorando qui in Intesa ho la fortuna di poter salire e arrivare ai piani alti del palazzo, dove devo dire ogni volta mi rendo conto quanto Torino sia una città meravigliosa ed elegante. Detto questo, siccome vorrei introdurre il professor Younger, diciamo entrare rapidamente nel tema e lasciare lo spazio a lui, se non è un problema io passerei all'inglese per introdurre appunto il tema della lezione. So, Professor Younger have unveiled a very old-style way to present ideas in history. We are not talking about posts on social networks, but he decided to draft a manifesto. We all know that manifesto from the Latin means something that can be known by the whole community, no? And in this era of digital revolution, the community is the world. So a manifesto, a pamphlet, needs time and arguments to be written and attention to the possible counter-arguments. It is a kind of thesis that raise the position and the idea of the author. So I would like to define this, Professor Rupert Younger, an act of courage. You did an act of courage because in times where people, I'm talking generally, where people hides themselves and their own ideas on the 280 characters of a tweet, doing a manifesto is something very, very, very important. The courage of Professor Younger and Professor Partnoy is maybe more relevant because they have raised what someone believed to be a wreckage of history, the concept of inequality and the Communist Manifesto of Marx and Engels of 1847 or 8?
48 published, 47 written.
Great. So in times where life is moving faster and faster and globalization has actually helped people all around the world to escape from poverty, except for those which are living in countries already developed, the traditional neoliberal way of thinking does not even see the inequality which exists in the current world. But the concept of inequality, and this is the most interesting, I mean, it's very interesting. The concept of inequality used by Professor Younger is wider because it also includes the inequality in representation. That's an interesting point because I'm talking about the right of each one of us to be heard by the society, by the public authority, the right to participate effectively to the democratic decision-making process. So in the manifesto, people who have such a right are defined the haves from to have. while the other ones are defined the have-nots. So using the title of this event, using the title of the Biennale Democrazia of this year, have and have-nots are divisible against the invisible. The have-nots have expressed, we all know that the have-nots have expressed all the, let's say, frustration, problems towards the haves. We could define the haves, the elites, at the ballot box and outside. For example, consider the Brexit referendum or what is happening in France in these days. But it is important to understand that there is also a more progressive populism which is growing and which differs from the conservative populism. The inequality suffered by the have-nots finds its first voice in people who offer them easy-to-use ways to solve the problems like protectionism, while, for example, denying an affordable health care. But we all know that there is there is also, we all know that those solutions are not the most effective tools to overcome the growing inequality in the world. They are kind of smoke and mirrors, clearly not solutions. That's why Professor Younger have called upon activists all around the world to unite and try to represent the have-nots and really give them voice. The importance of activists to come together during a period of crisis of Western democracy cannot be understood, in my view, if you don't look at the past. Times of economic and political crisis have always been turning point in history where people, the have-nots, are fascinated by simplistic solutions that are often linked to something which is very far from the concept of democracy. Unfortunately, again, we all know that there is nothing simple in the solution of complex issues, and there is nothing good in something which is very far from democracy. So activists all around the world should unite to avoid such risks, because as the manifesto say, and I read, the activists are the most advanced and resolute section of the have-nots movements of every country, that section which pushes forward all others essentially because they have, over the great mass of the have-nots, the advantage of clearly understanding the line of march, the conditions, and the ultimate general results of the have-nots movements. So, Rupert, very interesting, and the floor is yours. Thank you.
So, good afternoon, and thank you for making it here today through the anarchy marches which are outside. It feels particularly apt that we are meeting to talk about the rise in activism and the role that activism can and should play in delivering a democracy for all on a day when we have these marches from the anarchists here in Turin. So well done for making it, and thank you for being here. What would Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels write today if they were sitting here in this room having this conversation? That was the question that Frank Partnoy and I asked each other, and was the genesis of this manifesto that ended up being written. We open with the line that says, "A spectre is haunting the world, the spectre of activism. All the powers of the old world order have entered into a holy alliance to exorcise this spectre. It is high time that the activists should openly, in the face of the whole world, publish their views." Now, those of you who've read the Communist Manifesto, will realize that that is word for word what Marx and Engels opened their manifesto with, except for one word. And that one change was to change the word socialists and place activists in its place. The really fascinating thing for us was that at the end of this reimagining of the manifesto, we had only changed 26% of the words. 74% of the words that Marx and Engels wrote back in 1847 remained, in our view, as relevant and as powerful today as they wanted it to be back in 1847. And that fact alone felt to us to be a very, very powerful call to arms for us on the question of inequality today, and what we could learn from one of history's most famous documents. The original famously declared, "The history of all hitherto existing societies is the history of class struggles." For Marx and Engels, in a capitalist system, a sequence of widening splits between the classes was inevitable. The bourgeoisie would become more powerful as markets expanded. Disenfranchised laborers in the proletarian class, and eventually they would then boot them out. Ultimately, a revolution would end capitalism's reign. That was the original intent of Marx and Engels. Now, to be absolutely clear, I am not a Marxist, nor am I advocating revolution. I am a fully paid up son of capitalism, and for someone who has worked in the world of business consulting, and for the last 11 years in business academia at the University of Oxford. So given this, what brought me to the point of being here with you today, presenting a reimagining of the most famous writings of two of the most disruptive intellectuals of the 19th century? Well, it's a strange journey to be sure. I met my co-author, Professor Frank Partnoy, who is Engels to my Marx in the story, and I met him 10 years ago. And if I am classified as a fully paid up son of capitalism, Frank is a hardcore version of me. His career started in finance. He was a bond trader, a more red meat-eating version of capitalists would be hard to find. And then he moved into academia. And it transpired that this was a brilliant move for him. Frank is a natural scholar, someone who took to the world of discussion, debate, nuance, endless argument, and creative dissonance like a duck to water. He became a professor of law and finance at the University of San Diego, not unlinked to the fact that the weather temperatures there never moved outside the 69 to 71 degree range. Although last year he then took up a position as a professor of law at the highly prestigious University of California at Berkeley. He's written various books, including an acclaimed one on the benefits of procrastination. And he dotes on his beloved golden retriever dog, whose picture adorns the front cover of his book. My own career followed a similar path. I started in business, co-founding a strategic consulting firm called Finsbury, where I worked with major companies on their engagement with financial markets around the world, and on competition policy and on wider policy matters. I'm very honored to have worked with many of Italy's leading companies over the last 25 years. But I am a proud Scotsman. If I could apply for joint citizenship, something that the Brexit process has made a much more attractive thought, then my choice would be Italy. as the Italian and Scots rugby teams demonstrate, we have much to share and we have much in common, normally at the bottom end of the league. And I too have a super strong relationship with my dog, a Labradoodle called Biscuit, which resembles an Afghan rug on legs. As it is with Frank and his dog, I am its devoted servant. So our initial idea was to write about shareholder activism, something we can both claim some form of expertise in. My theory was that shareholder activism had evolved through 3 critical phases and was about to enter a 4th. The first phase was lazy activism, and that was calling for the breakup of large conglomerate companies. The second stage was what I call geek activism, technical, clever, financial stuff, normally to do with balance sheet efficiency. And the third phase of activism was operational activism, actually changing the nature of the business. The 4th shareholder activist movement is one where traditional shareholders themselves become activists. And in fact, we're seeing this today with BlackRock and other organizations doing exactly that. But this book, while interesting, just seemed a bit too obvious. And to be frank, too boring to write. So we started to imagine what might capture our interest on the question of wider activism. Now, to be even more completely truthful, most of our ideas were formulated over several rounds of beer in Oxford's oldest pub, called the Bear Inn. It was founded in 1242, this pub, and it still offers a great space to debate alcohol-fueled ideas. And this idea certainly demanded a large amount of alcohol to get our heads around it. Move on forward a few weeks from that meeting in the pub, and it was on a call to discuss this wider activist idea when the first light bulb moment happened on the communist reimagining. Frank asked me on the call if I could think about activist movements that might give us some insight from history into what we could expect in shareholder activism. And we both started thinking about this question, and Frank suddenly threw out this thing. He said, "What about the Communist Manifesto?" When he said this, we both stopped. And then we both laughed, because it seemed preposterous, this idea that we could rewrite or take anything from a document that had been the cause of such repression from so many regimes all over the world. But as the laughter died down, the silence came, and we suddenly realized that we'd found our voice, the voice of how to make the concept of rebalancing power much more contemporary, based on history. So, and as we wrote in our manifesto, by the start of the 21st century, we are faced with the extraordinary fact that the top 1% of the world's population owns the same resources as the remaining 99%. Those at the bottom are less upwardly mobile than in previous generations. Entrance to the wealthy gated communities is blocked not only by private security guards, but also by the increasingly prohibitive costs of healthcare, technology, and education. There is the dominant force of mass incarceration, with millions of poor, minorities, and the powerless walled off from the rulers that they might threaten. The haves never in history have had so much advantage over the have-nots. Like the inhabitants of mid-19th century Europe, we live, according to my colleague Alan Morrison at Oxford, in the wake of a calamitous financial crisis and in the midst of a whirlwind of social change, a popular distaste of the financial capitalists, and widespread revolutionary activity. The penny had dropped for us, and we immediately knew that we had our important idea, our idea worth sharing. So, let me then just talk you through what we did. In 1847, you have here the pictures of Marx on the left and Friedrich Engels on the right. Now, the first thing to just anchor in your minds is that they were very young, 29 and 28 years old. They were young and angry men, but they were men with a cause. Actually, incidentally, they were not from the have-not class. Both Marx and Engels' parents were wealthy, and they had a privileged upbringing and education. So they were unlikely architects and authors of this manifesto. But three things drove them to make the breakthrough in their thinking back in 1847. The first is this question of technological revolutions. This was the time of huge change in transportation, engineering, communications, the eve, of course, of the Great Exhibition in London in 1851. So a time of big technological change. Secondly, it was a time of political uprisings. We are here in Turin, and in 1847, already the south of Italy, Sicily, had erupted in the revolutions of 1848, and it was about 3 months later that the revolutions arrived here in Torino. And thirdly, economic uncertainty. 10 years prior to what they had written, there was a massive economic crash in several markets in Europe. So, fast forward to today. And if you think about the same themes, technological revolutions, political uprisings, and economic uncertainty, that absolutely clear juxtaposition of the position in 1847 and what led them to their conclusions about revolution are what first struck Frank and I about the similarities today. I'm, of course, slightly older than Marx, and Frank is, of course, slightly older than Engels, but we're both going to gloss over that lack of difference. The second thing that struck us is the role of elites. In 1847, this was a world dominated by the old order. In 1847, the ownership of all means of control was vested in the ownership classes. The elites mainly landed, but the early political elites. 2019, we feel that the big question of power now lies with the Davos elite. That group of people who use their wealth and power to try and solve some of the world's biggest questions, or so they say. But it felt to us to be a very strange world where inequality has become so wide, and at a time when the Davos elite fly in on their jets to Davos and then talk for 3 days about the impact of climate change. So, this dissonance, this distance between those in elite positions and those who they seek to govern. Like Marx and Engels, we thought we'd have a bit of fun with this. Marx and Engels actually wrote the Communist Manifesto in 9 weeks. Pretty quick. But it's not a long read. It's about 28 pages. We decided we'd copy that. So we also wrote the Activist Manifesto in 9 weeks. Marx and Engels met twice. So we met twice. Marx and Engels then started with their first manifesto being published in one language and are rolling it out over a series of 20 years into different languages. So we are doing the same. It's been published in English, it's about to be published in German, and then we hope to roll it out into other languages. So we're trying to mirror the conditions. And like Marx and Engels, who wrote their manifesto as an agenda for the communist meeting, which then produced the signed-off manifesto, we had an activist meeting in Oxford last summer. The critical parallels seem to go much further. On the left here are the 4 chapters of the Communist Manifesto. Bourgeois and proletarians, proletarians and communists, socialist and communist literature, and finally 2 pages on the position of the communists in relation to the various existing opposition parties. We followed that structure to the letter. But instead of those words, we simply replaced bourgeois with haves, proletariats with have-nots. And you can see then how this then rolls down, and we replace communist with activist. And the structure we found worked really well. At the heart, though, of the Communist Manifesto were these 10 demands. Now, this caused us a fair amount of problem, because any initial look at this list would have most people today thinking, this is just crazy. In particular, if you look at the abolition of property, point number 1. Can you imagine Marx and Engels today making that point with any form of credibility? We actually don't think so. Equally, can you imagine this idea of the centralization and the confiscation of property? Now, when we spent time on this, we suddenly thought, actually, on second look, a lot of these 10 demands, which is the absolute heart of the Communist Manifesto, actually are pretty relevant and happening today. Take a look at number 10, free education. Now, in this country and in the UK, we have a state education system, free education for all. So actually, on second look, some of what Marx and Engels talked about actually is very contemporary. The industrial armies, especially for agriculture. We felt this was particularly interesting because today, if you think about the industrial armies of migrants who move into agriculture from all across Europe to do the harvests in many different countries, these are the industrial armies that perhaps they were thinking about. Okay? Not centralized, but happening. So on second look, some of what they talked about actually had some resonance. But we absolutely had to make it relevant and contemporary. So what we did is we produced our own 10 critical set of demands. We feel these 10 points are what Marx and Engels would focus on today, and what would start to create less of an imbalance between the haves and the have-nots, the visible and the invisible. First, minimum acceptable standards of living and a meaningful opportunity of work. Second, preserving the environment. Third, respecting diversity in all its forms. The manifesto, the Communist Manifesto, was written entirely in the male gender. Our manifesto is written entirely as a cross-gender manifesto. The fourth one, supplying access to affordable healthcare. Facilitate education, that building block for the advancement of societies everywhere in the world. 6, rooting out and pursuing corruption, not just in the private sector, but also in the government sector. Providing security and protecting private property. This was our big change. They asked for the abolition of private property. We think if Marx and Engels were here today, they'd be asking for private property to be protected. Access to modern technology. I don't know, there's a number of young here in the audience who, if you're anything like my children, feel that technology and broadband is a right. Fast, high-speed broadband has become a right. Not something that you have to buy, something that should be provided and available for everyone all the time. This access to technology and what technology offers seems to be a critical issue. Finally, financial system and then enabling the locality over the state. So, that was our 10 demands, and it's interesting, when we finished writing this, we looked at the Sustainable Development Goals, the UN's SDGs, and actually a lot of this maps very nicely onto the UN Sustainable Development Goals. It was by accident, but it was a happy coincidence. So, what did we end up doing? In 1847, they talked about class inequality, and the answer was united socialism. At the heart of our manifesto is this idea of power inequality and united activism as the antidote to that concentration of power in the hands of a very small elite group of people. So, imagine what we mean by united activism. This is Malala, one of the most brilliant advocates of education for all, a terrible existence and early childhood with a lack of education in Pakistan, where she was denied access, and Afghanistan denied access to education. And her story, it absolutely reverberated all over the world. She's become a massive champion of education. So imagine the power if she came together on one of those 10 issues, together with Greenpeace. If the two of them could come together and argue the same thing. Add in a financial activist like Cerberus or one of these other major financial players. Imagine then the round table on sustainable palm oil, all coming together on the question, for example, of diversity. Imagine then Human Rights Watch joining that group. And imagine then the power if all of that lot together could unite and make a point about some of those early ideas that we had on those 10. Access to all for education, diversity. The power of that united activism would, we think, start to rebalance the power against the big, established, entrenched, modern-day elites. So, society and citizenship today, it's already happening. Patagonia, most of you here will know the Patagonia brand. They are super interesting on this question of activism. When you go onto their website to try and buy some of their clothing, they actively push you to their activist hub. They try and get you to become your own personal activist. Join up, make a difference. If you think about the anti-gun control movement in the States, where some of the big retailers are now dropping all weapons from their stores. And if you think about the disruptions happening in some very traditional industries, Airbnb, they have been an activist in their sector. This is now the world's most valuable hotel company. It's worth more than Starwood and Hilton hotels, and yet it owns not a single hotel bedroom. Okay? They've become an activist to create innovation and disruption in a traditional industry. And Uber the same. So I'll finish on this, which is, what is the alternative? Well, if you think about the last 3 major European revolutionary moments, you go back to 1789 in Paris, 1848 here in Italy, and 1917 in Russia. And exactly these type of issues are what produced, ultimately, society taking the elites to task and revolution. And with that, I'm going to stop. Thank you very much.
So, Rupert, very interesting. Maybe we can take some questions from the audience, but before I have just one question. Probably you already answered this question, but do you believe that Marx and Engels subscribes the UN SDGs today?
I think we'd like to think that they would think that they were a good starting point. And given the history of what they wrote, I think they would probably be a little bit more revolutionary in what they asked for. But I think as a base starting point, it's a pretty good reflection of what society needs.
Great. Questions? Rupert, one question more. Oh, sorry.
Why did you choose in your manifesto to protect private property? Why Marx and Engels would have chosen that today?
Thank you. Very good question, and one that we agonized over for a little bit of time. Private property, of course, was for them in the class system they were seeking to bring down. It was the most visible and most obvious repository of wealth for those class elites. We felt that today ownership of property has gone much, much wider all over the world, and that actually protection of your asset, often your most valuable asset, from some of the most vulnerable communities, was a critical part of protecting those people who don't have enough. So it wasn't just protecting the gated communities, it was protecting anyone who has invested in building any form of habitation or private property. So it felt to us to be the right type of overthrow of the idea. And we felt that actually Marx and Engels, well, who knows, but we felt that they could have probably got behind that one.
Hi. Two questions. One, you changed the slogan, the motto, Workers World Unite, with activists. Why not no haves unite?
Yeah.
Second, another question is that is like a reflection. Marx and Engels were German intellectuals, whereas in that time, Britain, England was really the imperialist country. So now the philosophers are British, when for Britain is not more an imperialist country. That's just
So thank you for the second observation. I'll just take that. Your first observation, I think, is a very fair question. And actually, if we had the chance to rewrite again, we may find ourselves broadening it to the have-nots. Because you're right. What this calls for is for anyone who is not in the elite to stand up and make the world understand. But the reason why we ended up with activists is because as a mechanism to hold the power elites to account, that's an established mechanism. There are platforms like Greenpeace, like Human Rights Watch, like Malala, where their power already is of a sufficient scale to start the process more effectively of holding those elites to account. But your challenge is a very good one. Thank you. Thank you. There's one there as well. And then one there.
Sorry about that. I got actually two questions. First is why locality versus state? I mean, if there was...
that was your question as well.
Sorry about that.
That's very efficient. We can take
because
that.
If there is something that I was told at school, that is that we have one world, and this started off possibly with the manifesto. So this is a very tricky point. Locality is a very important thing. In the last 20 years, everybody's saying that we have to live close where we were born, and we have close connection with this. Why locality? Please reason on this. And the second question is, we should expect a revolution. Where?
Okay, so let me deal with the second question first, which is we're not actively calling for a revolution. What we'd like is a quiet revolution where the power elites are held to an account which is more balanced than is currently happening. So to be clear, we're not trying to imagine this type of activity despite what is happening outside. Although sometimes a bit of revolution and action, revolutionary action, is not a bad thing. Now, to your question on the locality, to both of your question on locality, I think this is one of the most powerful points that we made in our 10. Because if you think about the post-war consensus, the post-Second World War consensus, it's been about internationalism. It's been about international institutions, the United Nations, the development of the European Union, these macro governance groups. And what I think is starting to become clear is that those types of big organizations, they entrench and embed the power of the elites. It's the elites at Davos who go and participate in all of the UN forums, all of those type of forums that exist. And I think that's an interesting thing to take aim at. When you then put that alongside the democratic power of local decision-making, which is evidenced almost everywhere in the world, that when decision-making is devolved down to local actors, you find that the people's voice is more represented in the outcomes that have been chosen. And so that double standard of the co-option of internationalism by the haves and the power to really put localism in the hands of the have-nots was the reason that we put that on the list. Does that answer your question? No, it clearly doesn't.
I was actually thinking about Europe especially, and the actual risk of Europe being crushed between powers like China or Russia. And most of the time today, the local empowerment is easily put in a nationalistic way, which can actually let me think about how to say this.
You can say it in Italian, and I believe that there is a translation here, if that's easier.
There was.
Oh, that might be easier.
For me, of course. Intendo dire che il rischio di forze centrifughe all'interno dell'Europa sarebbe più direttamente connesso, in sua opinione, a un inasprimento dell'ineguaglianza piuttosto che un più diretto legame tra le decisioni in locale e un eventuale superamento di tali disuguaglianze.
Thank you. I think that, now, first of all, you have to remember that I come from a country which is tearing itself apart at this very moment in many different ways, not just over the Brexit process, but over the question of national sovereignty. So we now have a Scottish Parliament, a Welsh Parliament, a Northern Ireland Assembly. So we have devolved power to our regions, and we're in the process of devolving even more power to the mayors of some of our largest cities. So we are adopting this process of more localism, not less. I think it's a really good thing, that. And actually, I think it does reduce, first of all, the power of the elites who sit and try to manage big groups, because that's highly complex and very, very tricky to do, and often means you make decisions which are for the benefit of maybe for the benefit of a very large part of the world, but has very serious consequences for certain parts of the grouping that sits below. Take a look at some of the ways in which the European Union has benefited certain key member states on certain key issues at the expense of other nation states. For example, fishing in Portugal versus the North Sea. So yes, I take the challenge, but I think actually localism, it works even more strongly in these big international pressure fights, which you've just referenced.
Good morning. It's very interesting your opinion, because the 74 of the words used in the manifesto are actuals, no? 74. And the other 26 are not actual because of the development of the capitalism necessary some changement. I agree with you. But why have you put in your manifesto the financial system for the growth, generally growth economic? And the second question, why there isn't a radical criticize in front of the globalization economic without rights and without civil rights and social rights? Thanks.
Thank you for both questions. The first question was why is one of the 10 points about protecting the financial system. The financial system point, we think the financial system has precipitated a phenomenal amount of worldwide growth and improvements in the majority of people's lives. The ability to transact, to invest, and to do so across boundaries has been incredibly powerful. But what we do think is that unfettered financial power has been a problem, and that actually that the power imbalances in finance need to be moderated. Finance, which is why we use the words, finance has to be available for all and for society, not just for the few who have become enormously wealthy. I mean, if you think about the visual inequality that has existed on wealth between the haves in finance and the have-nots outside finance, it is astonishing. If you look at the amount of money that individual hedge fund managers have made, and now actually take finance out of it and think about tech companies. Tech companies are making an enormous amount of money from your and my data. Okay, so that's the finance point. The second question again was, sorry, I apologies, I've forgotten the second.
Against globalization, the form of development of capitalism.
Yeah, so actually we think the entire manifesto is actually about a global movement, because the issue is not globalism. We think globalism can quite happily sit alongside this manifesto. But when you have as the world becomes much more interconnected, you need to have many more power restraints or balancing check systems against the appropriation of power in an increasingly large globalized world. And that's the call for the activists to unite as a balancing factor against the co-option of the benefits of globalization by the few.
First of all, I would like to congratulate you for this brave rethinking and reimagination of the Communist Manifesto when you are a capitalist yourself, and when the experiences historically of the applying this concept on the ground made a lot of deaths of millions of people. So I would like, there is no doubt that the goals and the aims after these ideas are noble, but the history and when we want to apply this concept on the ground, there's also this kind of very grave consequences. So did you think, when putting these 14 points and 14 rules, did you think of its doability? Is it doable? Think of what's happening now in Venezuela, what's happening in France. It is okay to want education for all, healthcare for all, but is it doable?
So thank you. Certainly, education for all and healthcare for all is absolutely doable. It's already been shown that it works in major developed countries, and there's no reason at all why access to education and access to affordable healthcare, which was the 2 points that we made, should not be absolutely achievable in a world as interconnected and as wealthy as we have today. The first part of your question, which is about the risks and the question of the gilets jaunes in France and what's happening in Venezuela, well, we were very clear that we are not seeking revolution. We're not seeking people on the streets making their voice heard. But we don't rule it out, because it's just not something that we call for directly. Our point is rather that there are ways in which the power inequality can be held into a better equilibrium. And that equilibrium would be best served by the activists who have power, by the way, but they need to act outside of their silo. Greenpeace needs to not just think about what's relevant to Greenpeace, but it needs to develop intelligent links with some of these other really wonderful activists in different areas. And actually, it's interesting because these type of links are already happening. In about 2 years ago, the California State Pension Fund teamed up with an activist group and Apple to run a campaign to get people with Apple products to watch their screens less. Apple joined this. Buy our products, but use less of it. Now, that's interesting, because that's a grouping that you would never normally think about coming together. And if they were narrowly pursuing their own interests, actually, they probably wouldn't have come together. But what they saw, I think, is the opportunity to create a better environment, a more sustainable, fairer, balanced way for the incredibly powerful devices that Apple produces to be used more in a better way by the majority of people. In this country, interesting, NL has teamed up with Greenpeace to think about the development of renewable technologies. Now that's interesting as well. A historically non-renewable company moving quickly into the renewable space and then working with another activist group to try and help them to achieve the right type of balance on renewable technologies. I think those sort of coalitions are wonderfully powerful, and we should see more of them. Thank you.
C'è una domanda? Qua. Ce ne sono due.
My question had to do with what you've perhaps partially answered, which is how you move from activist to action.
That's the million-dollar question. Yeah. And you'll notice, by the way, that we completely flunked that. We avoided the question, almost unilaterally, partly because we didn't want to be seen to be activating ourselves for some form of a political movement. We actually did discuss the idea of whether this should be more than a manifesto and whether it should sit as part of some form of a political movement. I think Frank was keener on that than I was. I think thankfully, to my mind, we didn't do that, because I think actually when you release the power of activist behavior, which is what we've tried to do with this manifesto, you're seeing now the emergence of a very interesting grouping of political parties and action-orientated groups who are picking up on these ideas. I mean, the mere fact that the Gilets Jaunes have done so much to achieve a focal point on what they are interested in Paris is kind of interesting. And it's a very modern interpretation of holding power to account. So we flunked it, we missed it, but I think maybe with hindsight, I'm glad that we did, because there are others who can do it better than us.
C'era il signore, quinta fila.
Good evening. I would like to know if you took in account the possible reactions of the haves against the united activist movement when you wrote the manifesto. Thank you very much.
What a wonderful question.
Yeah.
And of course, we feel, both Frank and I think, feel challenged on this question, because we are ultimately also part of the haves group. You know, we both have good jobs, we're both well educated, we're exactly the people who we think have too much power in this manifesto. So, did we think about the reaction of the haves? Absolutely. In fact, we wanted the haves to react in a way they have reacted. I mean, we've had, when we published the summary of the manifesto on the FT, we've had 120 comments, which came, bearing in mind it's readers of the FT, we're talking about the haves community. And the reactions were hilarious and entirely predictable. The first comment, I think, was, this is stupid and you should feel ashamed. Then there were many comments saying things like, this is the most stupid thing I've seen in the Financial Times. I'm cancelling my subscription. Okay? And then on the other side, there were some comments saying, absolutely, go ahead and fight, signed by Sir someone or other. Okay? And then there was this strange group in the middle, again haves, who were highly educated and who used the manifesto as a way to showcase their own thinking about communism, socialism, etc. So we had diatribes, sort of 25-line diatribes about constructivism and sort of other similar things. So did we expect the haves to react? Yes. Did they react? Yes. Should they react? Yes, because we're taking direct aim at ourselves.
In your opinion, why the even most strongest democracies have failed to deal with inequalities? At the end of the day, today the situation is very different from the times when Marx and Engels lived. Every one of us can vote, so why, now that we are in democracies, we have these problems?
So I think the critical difference between 1847 and 2019, is that the inequality was absolutely a class inequality back then. And so the haves in power were the elites. They were the landed gentry on the whole, and they were the people with wealth. And it wasn't just the people who were exercising political control, it was the levers of economics. So everyone who owned a factory was using the proletariat, the workforce, to achieve an even greater imbalance in the societies the accumulation of wealth directly to the owners of the means of production. Marx's words and Engels' words, not ours. Today, of course, you're right. You know, we have a world that where capitalism has improved enormously the livelihoods and prospects of many, many billions of people around the world. But at the same time that we've had that growth in economic value for the world, we've had that rise in inequality. And we feel that the inequality is centered now on power, not on class. That's the critical difference between 1847 and today. We think Marx and Engels would be horrified by the idea that not only do the top 1% own more than the bottom 99% in today's society, but five individuals own more than the rest of the world put together. 5 individuals. It's an astonishing feature.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
So I think that in order to do this quiet revolution, as you mentioned, I think we should have the largest popular support in history, maybe. And do you think this is possible in this political environment, at least to have the support you need from the not-haves?
So thank you, a great question. And I think the answer is an absolutely categoric yes. Take a look at what happened in the Arab Spring. Take a look at what's happened, for different reasons, with the election of Trump. Take a look at what's happened in Britain with Brexit. Take a look at Occupy Wall Street. The ability, the mass ability for people to organize around concepts and ideas and to have their voice heard has never been more possible. A great friend of mine, one of the co-founders of Twitter, Biz Stone, talks eloquently about this. And it's a strange thing because when Twitter was founded, they had very narrow objectives. It was a sort of geeky app, something which was created to connect people who otherwise would have had to ring each other individually. And they launched it at South by Southwest in Austin, in Texas, as a way to get people to come to the right bar. Okay, that's what Twitter, the first tweet was saying, there's a big queue outside this bar, don't go there, come to this bar. And they realized suddenly how powerful this was. But could they have imagined that the Arab Spring would have been powered by Twitter? No. But it shows you what can be achieved, because the connective power of technology today is incredible. And people can organize on a mass scale instantly in a way that has just, through history, never been possible. So the conditions are right, if I'm to use a Marx and Engels phrase.
The last one?
Mr. Younger, I'm curious to know whether you presented your works in the former Soviet Union area, and how was the acceptance among the haves and among the have-nots?
We have not presented our work formally or yet directly in any of the former Soviet Union states, or indeed the communist states. But we know that they have been circulated and discussed.
So,
I'm not sure if I'd like to be...
Yeah.
I kind of don't know what my reaction would be in there, but maybe. Probably.
There is one more.
Of course, yeah, whatever you would like.
The last one, 2, okay.
The last 2 questions.
The last 2 questions.
And then
there are 3.
The last 3 questions.
Mi scuso perché non parlo inglese.
It's better than my Italian.
Io sono un rivoluzionario perché sono un attivista di Amnesty International, e ho capito che il modello che lei propone è quello che le varie organizzazioni tipo Greenpeace e tipo Amnesty si coalizzino e trovino una qualche strada per portare avanti questa azione di redistribuzione della ricchezza e dei patrimoni nel mondo. La domanda che le faccio è: ma come lei pensa possa realizzarsi una governance tra queste organizzazioni che sono molto chiuse e ognuna con la propria mission, ognuna con un proprio modo di pensare, e sono molto, molto protagoniste della loro attività? Come pensa che si possa, in quale piattaforma lei pensa che sia possibile, le Nazioni Unite piuttosto che da qualche altra parte, creare una governance, un qualcosa che possa, una guida? Grazie.
So thank you, and it's a great question. And actually, I'd say it's even more difficult than you suggest, because the one thing that these organizations don't want to do is to share their funding platforms and to share the ability to work across groups, because if you're Amnesty and I'm Human Rights Watch, I don't want you to suddenly have access to my group and then find that they're paying you subscriptions and not paying my subscriptions. So it's even bigger a problem than you suggest. The answer, we think, is not to come up with big overall groupings. The answer, we think, is to be nimble and to pick the issues that connect. And they may be very transient issues that may only last for a week, a month, a year. But they come together behind an issue. It might be Me Too, diversity, climate change, whatever it's going to be. And they focus on a practical grouping on one issue. And they can then disband. So they're not having to be governed in a macro problematic way that you rightly suggest.
Good afternoon, Professor. You described Uber as a positive company, didn't you?
I described them as a disruptor.
Disruptive. And so in Italy there's this problem. Taxi drivers, Italian taxi drivers, fear Uber, and they are normal, qualified workers by the Italian government, and they actually don't know what is Uber. So my question is, could taxi drivers and Uber work together with no problems, or will it be some sort of battle? Thank you.
Well, history would show that it's a battle, absolutely. It's been a battle not just in Italy, it's been a battle in the UK, where black taxis in London blockaded the streets against Uber. So it's been it's a global battle. And to me, this highlights the silos, because the taxi drivers are protecting their historic way of working, and Uber are trying to innovate around this idea of flexible working and allowing people to take control of their working day and drive for 3 hours, 1 hour, 4 hours without contracts. Both of these two actually are, or should be, united on the future of transportation, because the one thing that is going to disrupt all of them is driverless cars. So they're working in their silos, focused on the day, and they've missed the entire big picture.
Great. C'era un'ultima domanda, se non sbaglio. No? Rupert, thank you very, very much for this incredible moment. And thank you for coming in Turin. Thank you very much.